So let's have a look at something called the TOTE model, which I'm sure you recall from your practitioner program, but we'll put some graphics up just so you really understand this. Now the TOTE model, as you may or may not remember, first came from a book called Plans and Structure of Behavior by Miller, Galanter and Prebram back in 1960, I think it was. And they said, you know what? People do things in their head before they actually do a particular behavior. And this was in contradiction to other thinking at the time where behavioral psychologists just said everything was a stimulus response. So this was almost the start of cognitive psychology. So they wrote this book and they took the TOTE model from computer programming and they sort of fitted it into how the human mind works. And it's a pretty good model actually. The TOTE model stands for test or trigger, operate, test, exit. And what the TOTE model actually does is it pretty well explains what you do in your head. It pretty well explains the whole theory of strategies. So if I may, I'd like to go through an example and we can look at how it works on the screen, on the graphics, and hopefully by the end of it you'll be absolutely clear on A, what the TOTE model is, and B, more importantly, how a strategy actually works. So we're going to work through an example and we're going to take a person who is going out to buy some shoes. And we're going to look at the TOTE model around this person's decision-making strategy. Now, for the sake of this example only, let's assume this client or person has a decision-making strategy of visual external, auditory digital, which relates to whether they can afford it, and a kinesthetic. So you'll notice that the components of the strategy, or their strategy, fits in the operate box of the TOTE model. So all good so far. So the person walks into the shop and they see the sign for shoes, and that might just be the trigger that fires off their strategy. So they are now in the operate mode. And they look at the first pair of shoes that they see, and they run a little test in their mind. They run this very quickly, and the test is, does that pair of shoes hit my visual criteria? And let's say, for the sake of argument, in this case the answer is no, they don't, and they exit the strategy right there. So each component actually has to fulfill for the strategy to move on to the next step. So the client moves to the next pair of shoes and they look at those shoes and they do the test in their mind. Does it hit their visual criteria? And they say yes. So they can move on to the next step of their strategy now. And they have a look at the price and they are £1,500, and they carefully put them back on the shelf because they've asked themselves the question, can I afford those? That's the AD bit. And the answer is no. So they exit the strategy at that point. So they move to the next pair of shoes. Probably getting bored by now. Well, I would be. So we look at the next, or the client looks at the next pair of shoes. Does it hit their visual criteria? Yes, it does. Do they, or can they afford those shoes? Yes, they can. They move to the next part of their strategy, which is, are they getting that right feeling? Well, actually, they're not getting that feeling. You know the feeling? No, they're not getting it. Guess what they do? They exit the strategy. And they have to start all over again with the next pair of shoes. And they look at those shoes and do they hit the visual criteria? And the answer is yes, they do. Can they afford them? Yes, they can. Are they getting that feeling? Yes, they are. Have I completed all steps in the strategy? Test, test, test. Yes. Buy the shoes. So that essentially is how the TOTE model works. And I think a lot of people look at diagrams of the TOTE model and think there's only one test for the whole operation. And there isn't. At every single stage, you will check to see whether you have met that criteria. And if you haven't, you will exit that strategy. So there's actually a test on every single component with the option of exiting that strategy early.